My name is Stu Greenberg, and I'm a member of the advisory board of the conference. And I was especially excited to hear the talk this morning, and even more excited when Kelly told me this morning that I would help moderate it. I have to say that Jesse is one of my favorite market researchers. Some of my other favorite market researchers are in the room too, so don't be jealous. And I think that we've really been very pragmatic in our approach to business issues, and we've solved a lot of problems together. I'm very interested in looking at this topic because I think that eye tracking is something that's been around for a long time. It's been used and abused and then used again. So I'm very much looking forward to the presentation, and we'll have time for questions at the end. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Stu, and thank you all for joining me. This is my favorite topic. I can talk about eye tracking all day, so good news, bad news for you all. I will watch the clock. But when I came to PMRC last year, I heard a lot of folks talking about eye tracking and sort of talking about how it had sort of come in and out of favor, as Stu has alluded to. And I know that part of the reason that it fell out of favor was with these COVID times that we've been dealing with, we've moved away from a lot of in-person interviews with doctors, with patients, making techniques like eye tracking a little bit more difficult to accomplish. And then the other thing was a lot of folks felt like it wasn't really actionable, right? They had done eye tracking because it sounded cool. It seemed like logical to apply it to market research. But then they got the results and there were these kind of pretty heat maps, but it wasn't really rich data that felt actionable or felt like it could guide decision making. So I really want to focus in on those two sort of maybe pain points for us as market researchers and talk a little bit about what I think the role of eye tracking could be in terms of the market research that we're doing. So the first thing, for anyone who's not done eye tracking, I'll give you just a little bit of an overview. But what we're going to be doing is using technology to literally, as it says on the tin, track your eyes. And so what we're going to be looking at is, where are you looking when you're completing some sort of a task? And you can do this in real world settings with head-mounted sort of glasses versions. But in general, the stuff we do with doctors, with patients, stuff we can show them on a screen, right? And so this is going to allow us to see what you're looking at on a screen in real time. How do you move between pieces? What do you focus on? What do you ignore? How long do you spend looking at stuff? And the value of this is that we know that when you're doing a task, where your eyes are focused is what you're going to be thinking about. And that may or may not be a conscious decision. There was an excellent talk yesterday about sort of the difference between the unconscious habit type of behavior that we do versus conscious sort of behavior that we're making purposeful decisions about. And a lot of the behavior we do when we're processing information, when we're reading, when we're watching a video, when we're looking at one of those sales pamphlets, a lot of that is unconscious behavior that we may or may not be able to articulate if someone asks us about it later. And we know that the brain is really good at doing this, and that it's going to process information as soon as you look at something. As soon as you fixate on something, your brain is already doing some work. And so we can use the eyes as a proxy to what you're probably thinking about. And a lot of this, as I said, is going to be subconscious. So if we ask a doctor to look at a visual aid and tell us what they like, what they don't like, they may or may not be able to articulate the things that caught their attention first versus later. Even with think aloud protocols, a lot of times a think aloud protocol may interfere with the task that you're doing, and it may not give us authentic behavior. So using eye tracking is a way to get us sort of a behavioral measure, a physical measure of what you are thinking about, even if it's not something that you can articulate. We have a really good way, we have many really good ways in market research to measure behavior and beliefs, right? Traditional research methods, surveys, ethnography, interviews, they do a really good job of getting at observable behavior, stated beliefs, and they do allow us to make some inferences, right? We can get inferred behavior from prescribing labs and from things like surveys and questionnaires. We can get at some inferences about beliefs. But this whole level of unconscious behavior that's happening underneath that is that black box. We don't know why people are doing what they're doing. We don't really know how they're making some of these decisions. And eye tracking gets us to that deeper layer that some of our traditional methods can't get to. And I know that when we talk about eye tracking, and especially people like me who are fanatics about it, you think that we're trying to tell you that eye tracking should replace some of these traditional methods, that you should be doing an eye tracking study in place of the methods that you normally do. But what I really want to challenge you to think about is how eye tracking can be used as part of, on top of, in addition to the studies that you're already doing, to add a layer of richness, to add a layer of depth to the data that you may otherwise be missing. Eye tracking doesn't replace a survey. It doesn't replace an interview. It doesn't get to a lot of those insightful, why are you doing this, right? What do you do when you have this type of patient? I need to ask you those questions. I need those traditional methods. But it gives me this added layer of data that I may otherwise miss. So to talk about how we do it and how we can do it now in maybe different ways than we've done it in the past, we need to do like 2 minutes on the technology. So it turns out that eye tracking technology, although it sounds very fancy, and for those of you who have done it, is very expensive equipment to purchase, the technology is very straightforward. What you need is a light source. In general, we use an infrared light source because your eyes can't see it, so it's not going to interfere with your vision. But the infrared light source comes at your eyes, bounces off of your pupils and corneas, and then there's a camera that captures that reflection. And it can use that reflection to triangulate where your eyes are in space. And then we can look at that, map that back onto a screen, and we can use that to infer what you're looking at on the screen, right? We can sort of calibrate it like you would calibrate any machine. And then there's image processing software that runs underneath that in real time that helps us to identify where you're looking on the screen, down to, depending on the type of equipment you have, a fairly small area of interest. And if you've done this before, you've probably seen all of this technology, the light source, the cameras, the software, baked into a single piece of equipment. The newer ones generally screen-based, baked right into the monitor, so you can interact with it like you would interact with a normal monitor. But the problem with equipment like this, as you might imagine, is that this is a one-at-a-time situation, right? This is like doing interviews. You have one person come in, they sit in front of the computer, you have them do some sort of a task, and it's going to be really labor-intensive because you're going to have to do them one at a time. And again, when we were doing interviews in person, back in the old days, pre-COVID, this was maybe not so bad, right? You had people coming in for interviews anyway. You could slide them into the eye tracking, and you could catch a little bit of eye tracking on top of what you were already doing. But it also sort of limited the size of eye tracking studies in general, the same way we sort of have to limit qualitative studies, right? An eye tracking study with 40, 50 people is a huge eye tracking study. Most of the publications you see in eye tracking are going to be well under 100 people, right? So you're limited in the way that you're limited in qualitative studies. But the great news is, in these COVID times, we have learned a lot about how to move many of the things that we've been doing online. And eye tracking is one of those things that we have been able to move online so that we can do virtual eye tracking sessions. And again, if you think about the hardware that you need and the software that you need, we're all using this right now, right? We do 1 million Teams, Zoom, all of these meetings online. We all have a light source. There's ambient light around us. It has infrared light in it. We can't see it, but it's one of the wavelengths that's being given off. We all have a webcam in front of us almost 24 hours a day. And the image processing software, we can either host online or we can host on our side. And we can build basically a sort of distributed eye tracking system that allows us to do eye tracking on a respondent's own computer. And what that means is that we can track any respondent anywhere in the world. We can do this during an interview. We can do this without an interview. We can just send them to do this eye tracking. But as long as they have a computer with a webcam and a light source, we can reach them to do eye tracking. And the nice thing about this is white on a very light gray. You may or may not be able to see. But in addition to meeting the respondents where they are, that means that we can roll this out at scale. What that means is I don't just have to limit this to interviews where I'm moderating and walking them through the task I want them to complete. That means I can bake this into a survey that I send out to 500, 1,000, 10,000 people, right? However many people you are surveying, you can collect eye tracking data on all of them because they can do this from the comfort of their own home. And it's simple to do. They set up a little bit of a calibration so that their webcam talks to the software and can map back to their particular screen, however big or small their screen is. This will work with cell phones, it will work with tablets, it will work with laptops. So wherever you get those physicians or patients taking a survey, you can now have a little bit of eye tracking baked into that. You can also do it during a moderated interview so that you can have the eye tracking take place in real time. And then if you want to, you could, for example, play it back for a participant and ask them to sort of reflect on their visual pattern. Seems like you really spent a lot of time looking at this. Tell me a little bit about that. This is something that you can watch in real time while it's happening from the comfort of your home while they are in the comfort of their own home, right? So one of the things that maybe has stood in the way is this limitation of having to have this equipment, having to bring people into a particular location to do this, and that's no longer going to be a limitation for us. What are the kind of things you want to do this with? Anything visual, right? Anything that you're going to have a physician, a patient, a respondent, a stakeholder, anything you want them to look at, anytime you give them a stimulus, even if that is completely text-based, no images, I want you to think about what value eye tracking might add. It might not be appropriate, but oftentimes it's going to add that extra layer. So for example, with a product profile, we show a lot of product profiles in interviews, in surveys, and then we ask doctors to make decisions, or we ask patients if they'd be likely to use this particular product. There's a lot of information there. Are they reading all of it? What parts of it are they reading? Do they skip around? Are there some parts that all the doctors focus on first before they go back? What's important in the product profile? And is it in the right place to catch the doctor's attention? I think visual aids, advertisements, concept testing, those things lend themselves really well and probably in an obvious way. Do they read the text? Which text do they read? Are they focused on the image? Did they look away from the image, right? We can answer a lot of questions about how people are processing information that we give them and what they see and what they don't see. What I think the real benefit is, though, and I think we miss an opportunity if we don't focus on this, is more of a comparative sort of understanding of that data, which is if you have HCPs in different segments, you've done a segmentation, you know they have different behaviors. How do those different segments of doctors process the concept or the product profile you've put in front of them? Maybe I give a product profile and 10% of the doctors say they love this product and want to prescribe it, and 90% of them don't. The 10% that want to prescribe it, what did their eye tracking look like? What did they look at? What did they focus on? What did they find interesting? And if the other 90% looked at something completely different and missed this clearly motivating salient point, what can I do to rearrange my product profile, my viz aid? What can I do to make this point that was clearly motivating more visible and try and sway the other 90% when they see it, or the folks in another segment when they see it, to sort of change the way that they interact with the material and bring their attention to the things that are going to be the most impactful in terms of behavior change. I know that one of the downsides that we have seen is that an easy way to visualize this data that comes out of any software you have probably used is a heat map, right? It uses these hot spots and cool spots to sort of show you where people are looking. If lots of people look in one spot, it gets colored red. Fewer people are looking, it gets cooler, right, towards the green end of the spectrum. And it is a really great visual display of the data. Don't get me wrong. I'm going to show you a heat map in a minute, so I have to practice what I preach. But it doesn't convey the underlying meaning, and it also aggregates a ton of data. And as you know with any data set, when you aggregate data, you lose a lot of the fine points, right? You lose a lot of the nuance when you aggregate data. And so what it's doing is it's taking fixations, where your eyes are fixating on the particular stimulus you're looking at. It aggregates them for you over the entire time you've interacted with it. So if you take 5 minutes reading a TPP, it aggregates your 5 minutes, and then it aggregates that with everyone else who's looked at it, and it makes this beautiful overlay, right? But you're going to be missing data when you do this, right? So what we want to do is we want to get to the level that's underneath this, okay? And the level that's underneath this are these fixations. Your eyes are basically doing two things at all times. They're either fixating, that is, they're stopping, they're focusing on something, and that's generally when you are processing what's underneath that fixation, or they're moving quickly between locations, which we call a saccade. During the saccade, your vision's basically suppressed. You're not sort of seeing what's underneath that. That's a functional movement that gets you from one place to a next. So if I have someone reading, for example, this multiple choice question, you can see the little dots are the fixations. That's where they've stopped, they've focused for a minute, and they've read. And the lines are really the saccades moving from one place to the next. So you can see after they get to the end of the paragraph, they're going to transition down and start reading through the answers. And you can see in this case that they're moving through them in a very logical order, as we might expect, right? So when we think about this, there's two sorts of levels of data that we might want to think about. Where are these fixations happening? How long are they spending there? And what order are they happening in? For something like reading, I would expect the order to be, in English-speaking countries, upper left to right, and then down the page, right? The order there is maybe less interesting. But with something like a viz aid, a concept, something that may have multiple elements to it, I may want to know a little bit about that. When we aggregate those fixations into a heat map, we're losing this level of data. And this level of data, the order, the time, the specific locations, is going to be important, particularly when we want to compare between groups, right? We want numbers on this. We want a duration. We want a number of milliseconds. We want a count, a number of fixations. We want to know where they are, and we want to know who's making them so that we can do a regular set of parametric statistics and find out what's statistically significantly different between these groups, right? So we're going to talk about going beyond the heat maps, getting some of that quantitative data. Time metrics, scan path analysis, that's going to look at the order of fixations. And then the added benefit to eye tracking is that you already have a camera pointed at your face. So another added value that you can do on top of that is to look at a little bit of emotional analysis, right? What are people feeling as they are moving through whatever stimulus you have presented them with? For the time metrics, we're really going to focus on fixation duration or number of fixations inside a particular area of interest, right? So we can define an area of interest any way we want to. An area of interest can be a paragraph, it can be a word. If you have a really fantastic eye tracker, it can be a specific letter inside a word. Probably not the level we care about for market research, but you can define an area of interest, or an AOI as we call them, any way that you want to. It can be an entire page, it can be a little bit of a picture. But what we want to do is we want to know how much time do you spend in each of those? Which of them do you see? Which of them do you never see? How many times do you look? How long do you look? And the thing we're really interested in, again, are the differences. This is what we want to look at that we miss if we just aggregate everything together. We want to pull out differences between groups. Does one group spend longer on a particular AOI than another? Does one group look at it more times? Do they look at it once and then return to it? They revisit that particular location again. If that's happening, that's clearly something that's either confusing or super interesting. And this is why we can't do eye tracking alone. We need to do it along with a survey, along with an interview, so that we can understand some of that behavior that we're seeing. So this lets us measure the behavior, and it lets us try to match that, triangulate that with the qualitative and quantitative data we're getting from other places. One of the best examples of this that I love, that you may have seen if you have done a lot of advertising and marketing in your life, is this example from a diaper ad. I know it's not really technically a pharma example, but it's one of my favorites. And when you look at this and you see the heat map here is beautiful and lovely, and it's easy to interpret. I can see that folks are looking quite a bit at this little baby's face. They're looking at the title here. They're reading through the paragraph. They're looking at the product. They're looking at the logo. I might look at this and think that I've designed a pretty decent advertisement. Folks are looking where I want them to look. I'm getting engagement, and they're doing well. But if I compare that with another version of the same advertisement with one tiny change, I turn the little baby's face so that it's facing that information, it's facing the paragraph. Humans really love faces. Again, this is subconscious behavior. I don't know if I could have told you after I read through this that I was really focusing on the baby's face and that I wanted to know what it was looking at. But you can clearly tell that once the baby has turned his face, people want to know what that's looking at, and it draws their attention away from the face and towards the information. And you can clearly see a lot more engagement with the message here, a lot more engagement with the logo, with the product itself than you see in this original image. This looks fine, and I might not have known that there was a problem. I don't know that I could have articulated, or our participants could articulate for you, that they weren't really spending as much time on this as we would have liked. But it's very clear when you see this data that there is a subconscious behavior that we may or may not be able to, may be conscious of, right? That is driving their fixation, driving their visual attention away from the baby and towards the message. So how can changes in messaging change these patterns? We need to understand what the patterns are first. We need to understand who's doing the behavior we desire, and then what can we do to move other folks into that desired behavior? What kind of tweaks can we make to drive those fixation patterns, to drive the visual attention in the direction we want? The other type of analysis we can do is a scan path analysis. So rather than just looking at how much time do they spend looking at something, or how many times do they look at something, we can also look at the order in which they process information. This is going to be less interesting, again, for message testing. If I have a message, I present someone with a paragraph, and I ask them to read through it, I can get a lot of interesting information in terms of the duration of how long they look at particular words or phrases. And there might be a little bit of scan path analysis in terms of how often are elements reviewed. Do they go back to a sentence? Do they go back to a paragraph? But in general, this is much more interesting for something that is more visually complex, like that advertisement, right? Is the first thing they see the baby's face? Probably, and then what's the next thing they see? It's going to be what that baby is looking at, right? And so that's going to give us some information about what's driving behavior and how they move from one AOI to the next, what draws their attention from one place to the next. To do that, we really reduce the fixations just to an order. We don't care how long they looked at it. We take that sort of two-dimensional XY space and we give it a sort of singular code, and we make a string of all of those fixations. And what that allows us to do is two things. It allows us to look for common sequences. Again, do I have HCPs in a particular segment? Are they looking at things in the same way? Are those sequences different for HCPs in a different segment? Or maybe I look at HCPs and patients looking at a particular visual aid. Are they processing it in the same way, or are the sequences different between those two groups? And then I can also look at how many times you transition between particular areas of interest, right? Is it that looking at the baby's face causes everyone to immediately then transition to the headline because that's where it's directed, versus in the first advertisement, maybe I look at the baby's face and then I look at the diapers and I sort of wander around a little bit, right? What's the transition between those AOIs? What drives movement from one place to another? And how do I draw attention to the place that I want to draw attention? And the analysis here, again, can be as statistical as you want to get. String edit distance is a really useful way. There's something called Levenstein distance. That's a really useful way to compare strings. And it will give you a mathematical similarity, something like a correlation coefficient, right? So you can see how similar is the behavior of two people or two groups of people. It looks at how many sort of insertions and deletions would I have to make their two visual streams line up. What do I have to do? Hidden Markov models really look at some of that sort of probability of moving from one AOI to the next. And we can use that, again, to tweak sort of the order of things to drive behavior where we want it to be driven. And then those transition matrices help us sort of identify similarities between scan paths, but then also to identify what parts are being revisited a lot, and are they being revisited for good or bad reasons, and what do we do with that information? The last piece of information that we can get out of eye tracking is this emotional analysis. And again, this is not something that I would say would stand alone, but we can use this to triangulate the information we're getting out of a qualitative interview or a quantitative survey. We can use this to lay on top of the eye tracking data. So we know when you're looking at a particular feature of the page, a particular paragraph, a particular section of the TPP, and we can get an emotional analysis out of that. And depending on the software you're using, they may bin things into just sort of positive and negative emotions. This one has a sort of array, including sort of surprise and confusion, which I think are really important emotions when we're presenting new, particularly clinical data. I want to know what's surprising, what's confusing. And we can overlay this on a point in time to know exactly what they were looking at when they saw that emotion, when we saw that emotion go across their face. So What it's doing is, again, that webcam's pointed at your face, so it's measuring your facial movements in addition to just your eyes, and it's looking at things like the position of your eyebrows, your mouth, your nose, and it's using that to understand and make some inferences about your emotions. Again, this is not something that would necessarily stand alone because it's a little bit open to interpretation, some of those facial expressions, right? But if I have folks telling me that something was particularly motivating, and I go back and I see that it was motivating because it made them happy, or it was surprising because it was new, that information can add that layer of richness to it that they may or may not be able to articulate in the moment. So I just want to sort of wrap it up and leave you with this idea of sort of reconsidering the role of eye tracking in the research you're doing. It doesn't have to be a standalone piece that requires this huge investment of time and infrastructure. It can be something that you can do online so you can track at a distance, or more importantly, track at scale. Eye tracking with 500 people is something I could never have imagined 5 years ago, 10 years ago, right? You could never get that level of data because it was so labor intensive. But now you can get these huge data sets that allow you to make inferences, that allow you to sort of enrich the data that you're looking at. It's measuring hidden behavior and beliefs that you're going to have a difficult time eliciting through a survey, through an interview, right? Through traditional methods. It's a layer of data that you don't want to miss, but that's really tricky to sort of pull out of people. It can be very quantitative. Heat maps really are sort of a qualitative way of looking at things, right? They say, yeah, they looked at this and they didn't look at this. That's very qualitative and may or may not be super helpful for you. But there are numbers that underlie this. How long did they look at something? How often did they look at something? What was the order? And you can do statistical tests on that to understand significant differences between groups, between iterations of a CVA, between iterations of message testing, and those quantitative comparisons can help give you information to guide decision making. And then the last piece is adding this emotional layer on. And I think the important thing here is not the general impression, right? If I ask someone to look at a CVA and tell me the emotions that they're feeling, they're going to tell me the emotion that they left with, right? After I've looked at this overall, here's how I was feeling. But if we can get real-time emotions mapped onto their behavior, we can understand exactly which piece is driving a particular emotion. So with that, I want to leave the rest of the time for questions. What I think would be really interesting is to consider thinking about, again, what stimuli are you showing them? Are you showing them a product X profile? Are you showing them a particular patient profile? What are they focusing in on? What's actually important to them in that? And again, the order that they're looking at things is sort of their priority, right? And so I think that there is some information to be gotten from that. I also think, if you think about presenting them with a list of options, I don't know if everyone saw the talk yesterday on sort of percent allocation, when we talk about percent allocation, and how folks, they tend to focus really heavy on the stuff that's at the top of the list. This is human behavior. There's 30 different drugs there. They're going to get tired by the end of the list. Eye tracking is one of those things that can help you understand, how are they moving through the list? Are they looking for a particular treatment to make their decision? Or are they just moving from top to bottom and they kind of run out of steam from the bottom? So I do think that there's a lot of behavioral information that we miss just by getting that final output, right? We get their percentage allocation, but we don't know sort of the process that they use to arrive at that. And I think this helps elicit some of that.
But if it's just words in like some kind of tabular format, you still think it would be valuable?
Absolutely, absolutely. The level of data that we can get here, again, depends on the software that you choose to use or how you choose to implement this. But I would say it goes from maybe the size of a dime to the size of a quarter. So I do blow things up, right? I use a slightly larger font size when I'm doing this than I might otherwise use. But if the font size is large enough that you can get good differentiation between what you're showing them, a table is a fantastic way. A graph, a table, anything like that, even words only. Again, there's a behavior that we want to understand, and that behavior is something we can elicit with eye tracking. It's a really good question. Yeah, so it's a really good question. So we generally use the same sort of permissions that we would use for a qualitative interview that we're recording, right? We let them know there's a calibration so they know it's happening. So in an interview, we talk them through it. In a survey, we give them a little bit of a text spiel, and they can opt out, right? So in a survey, we basically have 2 tracks for them in a survey. If they have a webcam and they opt in, they go through this track where we're going to do eye tracking. If they opt out, we can send them through a different track. So they know what's happening. It's very transparent. And we tell, at least in the interview, I talk to them and say, you're not going to know what's happening. So just interact with this like you would normally interact with it. I mean, I think that there's always that, again, that sort of Schrodinger's, when you're observing it may change behavior a little bit, but I think that's true in any sort of research that we do, right? Any survey, any interview that we do. So I don't know that it gets skewed any more than that, but we are very clear that it's happening. We would, yeah. I wonder if it's differing because we are all so much more comfortable with webcams and sort of being online at this point. And we also tell them, during this point, we're not recording your face. Like, no one's going to see a picture of your face. We're just going to get the numbers. So in interviews, I have had a 100% success rate. When I'm talking them through it, no one has turned me down. In surveys, I think we actually skewed the other way. 10 to 15% either didn't have a webcam on the device they were using in this day and age, weird, but or opted not to do it. So I think it's skewed just from a comfort level. And I think, I hate to say we're all more comfortable being surveilled at this point in history, but I think folks are more used to it. And if you say, we're not recording your face, no one's going to see this, we just want to know the data underneath it, they tend to be pretty comfortable with it. Excellent question. And I would say that the smaller the sample size, the more qualitative it does become. And so at that point, you're looking at what are you comfortable with qualitatively, right? If I'm comfortable with 10 qualitative interviews, the eye tracking data for 10 people, qualitatively I can look at. The statistical power of 10 people is not going to be there. So I may not be able to do some of the statistical tests with 10 people, right? I would say if you want to do statistical tests, 20 to 30 people would make me feel comfortable being able to make some, if they're in 1 or 2 groups, right? I don't want 10 groups, right, with 2 people in each group. But if I had 20 to 30 people in 1 or 2 groups, I think I could have really powerful statistical data. Smaller than that, I still think you can get some qualitative information out of there, which is what you're doing with 10 or 12 interviews anyway, right? And so it does sort of add that enrichment. And I think the benefit of doing it with that smaller sample and doing it with qualitative research is the ability to sort of replay for them the screenshot, sort of, this is the order that you looked at things in, and it will play it sort of in real time, showing them what they fixated on, and getting some more feedback on that, having them reflect and do some metacognition on that is something that you can do in a smaller group that may be tough in a larger group. So I do think it can also be a really rich qualitative tool. But if you want to get quantitative, I'd say for what I've seen published, 20 people would make me feel comfortable. I think one thing that has surprised me is how little the safety data is actually focused on. How much do they read the first line of that? What's the grade 3, 4, and then they move on with their lives. So I think actually some of what has surprised me the most with product profiles is what they're not reading in a terrifying way, right? But I also think the order, right? Because they're shopping around. They have something in mind for what they're looking for, and that's going to be different based on what else is out there in the class, right? So if there are other drugs in the class, they may really focus on the efficacy data. If this is a first in class, they may focus more on MOA. So I think understanding some of that differentiation of what are they shopping for this particular treatment. Maybe there are a bunch of other treatments, but they're really worried about side effects of those other treatments, and so they're looking for something more tolerable. Then maybe they do focus on the safety a little bit more. So I think it's really interesting to see, aside from what my assumption was of how they would read it, and again, it's in a paragraph. I assume you should process it top to bottom, left to right. But what do they seek out and what do they ignore? So I do think there's some really good information there.
One thing, because this is who I am, when we were talking about the emotional response and the expressions, I've done a number of studies in this area, and if you're interested in doing that, a lot of it is under the term micro expressions, because basically the people are responding, the respondents are responding without even acknowledging it. So the term is micro expression,
it's like a microsecond. It flits across your face.
Exactly. Just the sheer shock and terror of looking at your TPP. But in any case, so if you're going to look into that, you might want to look under that terminology. Jesse, a wonderful job.
Thank you so much.
Super interesting. I've personally worked with OptiBrand Rx quite a bit, and they're a good team to work with. So,
Thank you so much.